right, so I'm going to try to get my screen sharing and do it not in presenter view, hopefully, or at least be able to switch it if it goes to presenter view. All right, is that showing as the correct view for people, Michelle?
I think we're still seeing
Did
the
I switch it the
presenter
wrong
view.
way? Oh no.
Yeah, you're good.
Um,
And while closing that, I forgot to mention that we will save time at the end for questions, and we'll save some time and space to get through those. So if you have questions as she's going through her slides, please enter those into the chat.
what about that?
You're good. You can see.
Awesome.
Yeah, go ahead.
Perfect. So as Michelle mentioned, I'm Chloe Pearson. I am the new freshwater science specialist at the Nature Conservancy in New Jersey. And today I'm going to talk to you a bit about what we're considering a long-term case study of habitat restoration through dam removal. First, I want to quickly cover kind of what we're doing at the Nature Conservancy in New Jersey in the watershed that we're going to be talking about today, which is the Paulins Kill. So the work that I'm going to talk about today is a portion of what we've been working on, but it does link into the watershed as a whole, as many dam removals and such do, because they're part of that watershed. So overall, there's been work on a 10-year measures and monitoring plan in the Paulins Kill overall in the watershed. The Paulins Kill River feeds into the Delaware River. So on this map, if people aren't familiar with New Jersey, you can see the Delaware River forms the border of New Jersey on the west. And I have highlighted here the Paulins Kill watershed boundary as well as the Paulins Kill River. It is in northwestern New Jersey, and it is about 42 miles long. All throughout that watershed, which was, I'll go back quickly, highlighted in that green color on this slide, is now this multicolor on this one. We have tons of work going on throughout this watershed. And as I mentioned, I'll be focusing a little bit more in detail on one part of it, but I want to mention everything as it is all linked. We do have a ton of water quality monitoring sites as well as other data collection sites. And here I'm highlighting just about 21 of them, casually 21 sites throughout a site throughout an area. It is a lot of data, which is really awesome. I do want to also mention that there are multiple dam removal sites within this watershed, other than just the one that I will be talking about today, which is the former Columbia Dam. So you can see this is all really tied in, but this Columbia Dam is the one that's closest to the Delaware River. Broadly, why do we care about removing dams? Overall, one of the biggest things is that they're a barrier to fish migration. This can really affect migratory fish in particular when we're talking about fish that require both freshwater and saltwater to spawn and complete their life cycle. Dams can be a really big barrier for these fish getting back into the freshwater environments. This can also be for migration doesn't always have to be this freshwater or saltwater. So it is anything migrating, which also includes this idea of nutrient transportation. So we have these spawning populations that maybe can't get to their spawning grounds, but we also have this idea of nutrient transportation both within these larger migrations and within smaller migrations in the watershed, where whatever you eat one place is going to get pooped out somewhere else. It's going to provide this transportation of nutrients to areas that may not have it. And these can provide barriers to that kind of migration if the fish cannot get past them. Another important kind of component of fish migration is actually the transportation of other critters, such as freshwater mussels. The freshwater mussels will hitch a ride on certain species of fish and will be able to travel to other areas to better live out their lives. Overall, this kind of idea of barrier for these fish, you can see it's not just for this one fish that needs to get by. It's a whole bunch of other stuff. There's also barrier for humans in terms of recreational ability. if there's a dam in the area that you'd like to go kayaking in, you may not be able to get past the dam, or it may not be safe to do so. And I'll mention a little more about safety in a minute. There's also interruption to just the general flow of the area, which impacts the water and habitat quality. This ties back to kind of everything I've mentioned so far, both fish migration, mussels, all these things, they rely on good quality water. If they actually can get to an area, they'll rely on good quality water and habitat. But it also is a barrier to recreation in that standpoint as well. People don't necessarily want to spend time in areas that are not going to be good habitat, good water quality, things like that. And then I want to mention the idea I kind of briefly touched on safety concerns. Dams in general can be a big safety concern. They can cause flows that you're not expecting, which can cause people to drown, unfortunately. So these are something that we have to be careful of, particularly for dams that aren't necessarily well maintained or well paid attention to. We need to take into account the idea of maintenance, which ties into safety, but also ties into a cost. These are big structures or even little structures that require some type of maintenance while they're in the water. They do degrade, and a lot of times the people that own them will be responsible for the maintenance, and it is a big cost to them. So these are a bunch of reasons that we might not want to have a dam in an area, and it might be better to remove them. The Columbia Dam was one of those such dams. It hits a lot of these kind of key factors that I've listed out, or it did. One of which being, this is a picture of it pre-removal, one of which being that it was a pretty large structure. It was 330 feet wide, 18 feet tall, and it actually was really, really close to the Delaware, as I mentioned previously. It was only a quarter mile upstream. It's that furthest closest to the Delaware in the Paulins Kill watershed. That means that the fish that we're trying to get up were pretty much immediately bumping their heads on this dam. They really weren't able to get very far. So the removal of just this dam opened up 20 miles to migratory fishes, as well as the dam, while it was standing, held back an impoundment of 32 acres, reaching about a full 1.5 miles up the river. And so you can kind of see that in this graph or this map, where we have highlighted the general project area is this green, but in this kind of seafoam color in the middle, you can see restored area. So this is when the dam was removed, how much of the area was impacted. So that's this big impoundment behind this massive structure. So that idea kicks into play. The migratory fish that can't get by, there's definitely safety concerns with a large structure such as that in the water. There's large impacts to the water quality because of this large impoundment, and it prevents not only the fish from going up, but you can't necessarily kayak down from that edge of the Paulins Kill to the Delaware in that area with that dam there, so it prevents the recreation aspect as well. So it kind of hits all of those key aspects. So that makes it a really interesting study for us with removing this dam. We were also then, a bunch of people sat down, not just TNC, but a bunch of other organizations that we worked with, sat down and decided what would be the best way for removing this dam to monitor this in a way that would be effective for understanding what the impact of removing a dam that kind of hits all of those key components, monitoring it so that we better understand the effects of it. So on our end, some of the things that we ended up monitoring, I'll go and talk through all of them. One of them was biological indicators of water quality in the form of macroinvertebrate sampling. Macroinvertebrates are these little, often, they're invertebrates in the water that often are the larval stages of other bugs that may end up not spending their whole life in the water, or they may spend their whole life. So there's things like stoneflies, mayflies, as well as dragonflies are all going to have that larval stage in the water. But then there's also things like crayfish that are going to spend their whole time in the water. So there's this variety of critters, but they also, depending on the species, have different tolerances for water quality. So some species are really sensitive and require good water quality for their survival, making them a really good indicator of the water quality in an area. Ideally, you'd want to see, to get an idea of habitat quality and the water quality in an area, you'd look for abundance of these certain species and what species are there. Springtime is a really good time to go collect these species because it yields the best representation. So we went out and collected following our macroinvertebrate sampling through DEP. We followed the same tier 3 that everybody does. We did an audit and everything so that all the data could be used across the board. It was standardized. We went out and did kicknet sampling to collect these critters and then sent them out for testing to end up with a biodiversity index score of poor, fair, good, or excellent. As I mentioned, these will take into account the type of critter as well as the abundance. And this gives us an idea of, at a site, how are the macroinvertebrates looking? But we can also then pair that with the EPA rapid bioassessment for a physical indicator at these sites, where you can look around at the habitat and look at things like how much sediment is there, are there good riffle areas, are there good pools? Essentially, is there variety for all these different types of creatures, both the fish and the macroinvertebrates and all these other things? Are they going to be able to find a place that they want to live and are happy to live in? And you can see that these are ranked in optimal, suboptimal, marginal, and poor. So we can get then, for habitat, these categorical conditions as well to then pair with that macroinvertebrate sampling. And we did that while we did the macroinvertebrate sampling. Another way that we ended up getting physical parameters was by doing water quality monitoring with continuous in-stream monitoring. We had a couple different ways of doing this, different loggers that we ended up using. So the couple that I'm going to really talk about today are temperature and dissolved oxygen. And those were measured using hobo loggers. These were at, I'll talk about more about what it was done at kind of each site. But I briefly showed that map where we had multiple sites along that impacted area of the Columbia Dam. We also then had loggers studying turbidity and conductivity, which I won't be talking as much about today, but if you have questions about it, feel free. I'm happy to talk about it. And it was done at these same sites for other purposes as well. Essentially, to put these loggers out, we deployed them in these bases that we made that are made of concrete. You can see that in the photo, a concrete base with a PVC pipe on top. These were put out in April through September, and the sampling was started, same with the macroinvertebrates as well. The sampling was started in 2016 and has continued through 2024. These loggers are quite heavy, so once you put them out, they should stay kind of in place and be able to record data every 15 minutes. You can kind of see in this right picture, just barely, there's a couple loggers sitting there that you can see. They almost look like sticks or tree trunks in the water. And we almost want them to look like that. We don't necessarily want people messing with them, so we want them to blend in. But they'll collect data every 15 minutes. And then I went out and other people went out and offloaded these loggers then every 2 weeks. Some of them because they're battery based, so we want to make sure that we can replace the battery. But even ones that have a longer battery life, we want to then check on these loggers and make sure that they're recording properly. They're not gone, they're not missing, they're not out of the water. That was a particular thing this year with how little rain we got towards the end of the season, making sure that they were actually in the water. But yeah, so getting this data offload every couple weeks. You can see, as I mentioned, it's every 15 minutes, so it is a lot of data, which is really awesome. And then we go through it and check to make sure that the data is valid by doing some discrete sampling. Essentially, we will take a sample at the time that we are pulling the logger to match it to the most recent logger detection. Discrete sampling just means that you're taking a snapshot of what the water is looking like at that time. And you can imagine that if we were going out and doing that over and over and over again, it would take a lot of work and a lot of samples to really assess the water quality conditions. So the idea then is you have the continuous loggers out there doing that for you. But sometimes, as with any equipment, they can have issues. They could drift away from their values and be reading, say, 5% DO when in fact it's 100% DO or dissolved oxygen in the water, and you can tell that that's not accurate by taking a sample at the time you pull the logger and compare them. So that's what we did also with discrete sampling to make sure that those logger values were good. Now to get into a little bit more about Columbia specifically, because all of these methods, while they were done at Columbia, they're also done all throughout the watershed that I brought up before. So to talk more about Columbia, I mentioned that we've been collecting data since 2016, but Columbia Dam was notched first in 2018 and then fully removed in 2019. So that means the data from 2016 to 2024 has kind of three categories in it of before the dam removal, during the dam removal, and after the dam removal. And this notching was important for this type of dam as well to allow that big impoundment to let some of that water out without immediately allowing all the sediment that may have built up behind the structure out. But it did also mean that the removal itself took a couple years. So again, allowing this kind of before, during, and after monitoring of this, which is what we're kind of considering the long-term monitoring of this site because we have that encapsulated. I brought this map up before, but I want to touch more on the sites that we actually have for this study. At the beginning of the sampling, I will point out the TNC 25 and TNC 23. Those have been getting sampled since 2016. So that will account for you can see this former Columbia Dam note. That'll account for an above and a below the dam recording, which really means that not only do we have this temporal data coverage with the before, during, and after, we have an above and below dam to really measure and see how that removal has affected those areas. And we do also have these two sites, TNC 80 and TNC 81, that were not sampled the entire time, as particularly TNC 80, you can see is within that impoundment. So they were sampled, however, once the dam removal had kind of taken place and was underway. So we do have data from those, although I will say today I'm more focused on 25 and 23 to give us that real comparison of the above and below, but I'll mention a little bit about those impoundment ones. And for moving forward, I just want to note that I'm going to be calling these U for upstream, because I know I'm calling these by arbitrary numbers, saying 23, 81, 80, and 25. So we're going to go with upstream. Inside is inside the impoundment, so our I, and D for downstream. So pretty much we're going to be talking about upstream and downstream, remembering that downstream means it's below the former Columbia Dam versus upstream is above it. First, I want to just talk through kind of what we can get from these loggers. And one of the things we can look at is temperature. So I mentioned we were looking at temperature and dissolved oxygen. With dam removal, we're expecting changes in temperature with the impoundment moving out. You have an entirely different ecosystem to heat up in a different way in that kind of meandering riverbed versus a big impoundment. So also with downstream, you're getting all the water kind of from that impoundment after it's been sitting and heating for a bit. So we're expecting this kind of downstream area where the impoundment water is coming in to be a bit warmer. And in the before removal, we did see that the downstream monthly mean of the water temperature was about 0.4 degrees warmer than the upstream site. And I will also mention, I don't think I said this on the previous slide, this upstream site is a bit above this general impoundment area. So this is a little bit like a control in that standpoint of we can really compare it to see kind of how this downstream might be changing. So in that before it was 0.4 degrees warmer versus in this, what we're considering after removal, the downstream monthly mean is 0.2 degrees warmer than upstream. And this may not seem like a lot, but it does mean that these, or it seems like these sites are getting more similar to each other over the years. Because this is all of these years considered, it's not necessarily one year where you may be having a big like temperature impact, because that's something we need to consider with this as well. It does seem like there is a trend towards the sites becoming more similar to each other between the upstream and the downstream sites after the dam removal. And this is also, you can see this, not only do we get yearly patterns, it's a really good look at some annual patterns as well, which I want to highlight a little bit briefly with some temperature versus dissolved oxygen. Because just as we'd expect to see as the temperature increases in July and August, you get a bit of a dissolved oxygen decrease. And this is for the downstream area. But you also see this in the upstream area. So it's kind of, again, that idea of them not being all that different, particularly I'm looking towards this kind of sage green is 2024. And they look very, very similar in this downstream and upstream. I actually had to kind of go back and forth between them and make sure that they were different graphs. Because they look very similar in terms of this monthly trend, which means that it seems like they're getting, again, more similar after kind of this removal. And just to even continue hammering that idea in a little bit, looking at the daily mean temperature, again, these inside the impoundment sites were not sampled the entire time. You can see them pop up when kind of the dam is removed. But there's this idea of in 2016, you had a lot of variability. The downstream and upstream sites were not, they're relatively similar, but there's a ton of variability among them. And then you kind of get to the after 2019 and into this 2020 through 2024, and things get a little more clustered together, a little more similar between kind of the downstream and upstream sites. And you get a similar pattern with DO, although I'll admit there's a little bit more scattered, particularly among these inside the impoundment sites. So there's a little bit more for me to dig into with that and kind of figure out what's going on exactly. But you can see this general trend that appears to be showing that they're becoming more similar after this idea of the dam being fully removed in 2019. And then this one was the actual values, and this is looking at those differences. And again, particularly this temperature graph, these plots get so much smaller as you get kind of towards 2024. They're becoming a lot less different, and they're closer to this 0, which means that they have less difference in between them, which I think really just kind of points to that fact, or not fact, this idea that these sites may be getting more similar to each other after the kind of dam removal happened. And I did just kind of label here where these removals happened versus this before and after, because that's part of this project, is really the idea that we have kind of the before, during, and after, which is really awesome. Talked a lot now about temperature and dissolved oxygen, and it's a little bit, okay, well, what does that mean? One of the things that this can impact, as I mentioned before, are the critters that live in the water. So one of those being fish. And actually, I talked a little bit about migratory fish earlier, but this time I'm going to talk a little bit about the fish that are just hanging out in the area anyway, which are trout. I want to talk about trout because they're particularly sensitive to to warming temperatures and lower dissolved oxygens, which again go hand in hand. The warmer the water, the less dissolved oxygen it can handle. They really like the cold water with high dissolved oxygen contents. So we have here the mean days exceeding kind of what we consider a trout maintenance threshold. So will they be able to maintain how they are currently? And that includes both days exceeding dissolved oxygen thresholds and days exceeding temperature thresholds. So on this type of graph, more is worse. We don't want more days of exceeding this threshold. And it may seem kind of like, oh, look, TNC 80 or this one of the internal in the impoundment sites is really high. But I do want to bring up, we have these measures for the entire Paulins Kill, all of our sites. And the numbers are a little bit small, but I want to highlight that our 4 sites for this Columbia impoundment are all kind of within this bottom quadrant here, bottom right quadrant. So they are a little bit higher on the idea of exceeding temperature, but not quite as high as some other sites and not quite as high in the exceeding dissolved oxygen thresholds. And particularly, you could see this one site gets much lower dissolved oxygen than some of the other sites. So yes, we do want less days of this, but it doesn't necessarily mean that having a couple days of this is going to be an immediate problem, but it is something to keep an eye on. The reason I mention it's not necessarily immediately an issue as well is because looking at generally the trends of our dissolved oxygen, again on this graph that kind of things are getting a little bit more similar as they go. You can look for generally fish like things to be, that should be the other, okay, there we go, above 6 parts per million, where 1 part per million is equal to 1 milligram per liter, which is what we're sampling in. And you can see I've kind of got a box here around what 6 and above would include. And that's pretty much the majority of the data that we're getting here for the daily means of DOs. So that kind of plays into, again, we're not getting these super high values of nothing compared to this other site here in the Paulins Kill of where these fish might not be able to maintain populations. So hopefully they'd be able to maintain these populations based on the temperature and dissolved oxygen at this Columbia Dam sites. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about those macroinvertebrate scores as we go through the dam removal. So you can see here, I've got, again, the 25 and 23 are the downstream and the upstream. And we have one of the intermediates that kind of comes around in 2020 when we started sampling there. And you can see they're grouped into categories of excellent, good, fair, and poor. So even in this time, I'll label it as before, during, and after the dam removal, even before we were sitting towards the good and excellent categories, there was an apparent little dip during the dam removal, which kind of brings into play this whole idea of wanting to do a longer term study. Because if you just did a study, the dam was removed in 2018 and 2019. If you were just studying during the dam removal, you might see what could be seen as a detrimental effect of this dam removal, when in fact it kind of goes right back up into this excellent category in 2020 and moving forward. Generally, we stay in that good and excellent category. So with this dam removal, even though we may have had a little bit of dip in the macroinvertebrate index, it comes back and we get to see some of this variability that you may get year to year in these 5 years even post dam removal. But the main takeaway from that is that we're seeing really awesome macroinvertebrate scores in these sites, both the above and below the impoundment. And similarly, other than 2024, there was a little bit going on with this intermediate in the impoundment site. So I'll look into kind of what was causing that. But generally, this impoundment area is following a similar trend to 25 and 23, the upstream and downstream. Again, leading towards that idea of things kind of getting more similar as that impoundment is gone and we have more of just a regular river structure going through. Similarly, we can look at those habitat scores in terms of these ones are categorized as optimal, suboptimal, marginal, and poor. Again, we don't have any that end up falling into marginal and poor at these three spots. We do see particularly the upstream site stay pretty consistent in the optimal. And even though you may see a little bit, there's a little bit possibly of reduction in the downstream site, which is interesting because of those habitat or those macroinvertebrate scores are still in that excellent category. So I went in and kind of looked at what might be causing that. And it is possible that some of these changes could be due to the sediment that was released in during the dam removal, because for these 2020 through 2023 points that are kind of dipping a little bit on that downstream site, there were worse scores in embeddedness and sedimentation, which are two of the categories that go into the habitat scores. However, then come 2024, they jumped right back up, and you can kind of see that in this general trend here. So even when there is this little dip, it can be due to something coming from this dam removal that might be happening and taking a little bit of time to resolve. And then it kind of resolves as well. And you can see those scores go back up. Once again, highlighting this idea of longer term monitoring versus just looking at kind of the short idea. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about we'll call it the elephant in the room, the idea that there was just a really big barrier removed and removing also this large impoundment. So we've talked a lot about things like the biotics, the water quality and things like that, but just structurally, there's a huge change in what the river looks like. We go from this big impoundment to kind of a meandering river, but it also then exposed this large area of floodplains. So I bring this up because the dam was removed in 2019. So this is pretty recently, pretty soon after that. And then there's a 32 acre, kind of mentioned this before, but then after the impoundment was gone, there was an effort to plant over 12,000 trees in 2019 and 2020. So I'm going to put a little star on this map here and point to kind of the right of the star, and you kind of see this floodplain area that looks like it's just got some grass on it. And then I actually took a photo just this year facing that grassy mound and looking at a sea of trees that were planted. So I bring this up because we're talking about this, or I'm talking about this monitoring study as a long-term monitoring study. It's been 5 years since the removal. However, these trees, even though they've grown, have still a lot of growing to do. And so there's this idea that even with our longer term monitoring, there may be still some effects of this restoration effort that are not yet apparent. These trees may end up fully shading this river area, which is partially the goal. And this is site 81, if I'm remembering correctly. It's one of the impoundment sites that we do sample. So we could continue to see some of the effects of this and even push further into this idea of the longer term studies, because a lot of this just takes a long time to really come into play. And then I do, though, that's one of the longer sides of it, but there's also a more immediate side of removing the physical barrier, and the fact that migratory fishes have already been documented above the dam pretty soon after the removal. So you can see where I had that fish bumping its nose into the dam before, it can now get further up. And before it was kind of bumping its nose then into, or they were bumping their nose into then the Paulina Dam, which is further upstream. But I'll mention a little bit more on the next slide that that one is now out. So it continues kind of this pattern of opening accessibility for these migratory species to get up the river. For this data, as I mentioned, it's tons and tons of data, both for the Columbia work as well as continuing with the rest of this Paulins Kill work. But for the Columbia work specifically, we're looking to get some of this data ready for publication. So still, obviously, a lot of what I've talked about today is very preliminary. I have a lot of digging in to do now that I've seen these trends, kind of picking through what might be causing these trends. You saw some of those figures are a little messy when you include 9 years of data. So trying to actually pick and choose what makes the most sense to make a story about this this plot that we're choosing to do with the Columbia Dam. So we're going to try to make a publication out of that. But so the publication is also to make some of this knowledge more accessible to people. The other idea that we want to have is, as much as we can, we're trying to do accessible data. So I mentioned we followed like the DEP protocols for our macroinvertebrate sampling. That's to ensure that we can share that data with people, and it's not just with TNC finishing out. We're going to be finishing out our 10-year plan and then kind of moving on to other things. So the idea is, what else can we do with this data to make sure that it doesn't just get, okay, cool, we have data for data's sake. We want to make sure that, one, we make stories from it, figure out what the actual story is, but also if other people want to continue with any of it, our goal is to really make it as accessible as possible. The other thing with this is that calling this idea of the Columbia removal, generally we consider it to be a successful removal, which supports then other projects, such as I mentioned the Paulina Dam. The Paulina Dam removal actually just finished this summer, so 2024. But the work that was done on the Columbia Dam really allowed us to say, okay, yes, we also monitored the Paulina Dam, and we were able to adjust kind of what we did in the Columbia monitoring to better fit some of the Paulina Dam work as well, including similar things where we have an upstream and downstream. We're able to really compare with that. But then also the Paulina Dam is further up in the Paulins Kill, which means that even if I try to look at just the Columbia, there's other things that get involved. So I mentioned some of the turbidity stuff is a little bit tricky right now because I was looking at the 2024 data and seeing patterns that I couldn't quite explain in the Columbia. And I think maybe there's some stuff coming down from Paulina, and I need to look to see whether that's accurate or whether I can even see whether that's accurate. So a lot of this will be working on explaining why some of these patterns exist, not just that the patterns exist. So then to kind of wrap up this whole discussion here, I want to just point out a couple things to take away. One is this idea that long-term monitoring can be really, really important, even when we're considering, even what we considered long for this like case study of the 2 years, 2 years pre, 2 years during, and 5 years post. That may not even be quite enough. We have to kind of consider this idea that some of these dam removal effects really take a long time, or restoration effects take a long time to be in play, like the tree planting and things like that. The other idea is that a lack of drastic change, so we didn't see any massive changes in temperature or dissolved oxygen, doesn't mean it's unsuccessful, particularly when you also take into account that year to year, we have completely different environments. So like the idea that this year we had such little rain, high temperatures, that may have some type of impact on these changes. So it's really, I liked more to focus on that idea of difference between the two sites, and see how kind of things are more adjusting in that way versus saying, okay, in 2016 it was this temperature versus in 2024 it was this other temperature, and seeing that there's not really a huge drastic change. So I wouldn't consider that to be an unsuccessful idea. And then a huge part about this is that one of the main goals of removing this dam was a fish passage goal and a connectivity goal. And we would say that that goal was achieved. Not only would fish be able to get through there, but going down there, there's lots of people that like to go fishing in that area. You could theoretically go kayak down into the Delaware now versus if you were trying to go over that 18-foot drop, that definitely wouldn't be safe. So there's a lot of this idea of just connectivity without any of the other stuff, even just that goal. We would say that this dam removal was a success. And that will wrap up my discussion today. So I'd like to say thank you and ask for any questions.
Thank you, Chloe. Great job. Lots and lots of data. Really great
Lots and lots
data.
of data. That's for sure.
Really great to see. There were some questions in the chat.
Yes, I'm looking
If
at them now.
you, I'm happy to read them to you, but also I welcome folks to go ahead and come off of mute if you want to ask your question yourself. But I think we have a couple we could probably answer. And I see one from Diane. What type of sampling was conducted to confirm migratory fish presence upstream after dam removal?
So there's a couple different types. That was more with partner work. There was eDNA work that was done as well as the fish were seen. And then I'm mixing up the name. I think it's IBI. There was a couple different types of sampling done by partners such as Fish and Wildlife. And I know, I believe John Vile talked about some of the eDNA work in a previous session, and it's on the YouTube, if I'm remembering correctly, Michelle. So some of that might be something to look at as well.
Yeah, so we didn't get too much into it today, but there
Yeah,
is on njdams.org, there is a webinar or an info session that the DEP had hosted all about eDNA and
yes.
monitoring and doing the fish surveys. So we encourage you to watch that, and we are continuing to work in partnership with the state and Rutgers University to continue to collect that data. And so we will likely have some more information coming out perhaps in 2025 on some of the more recent sampling. Okay, so
Yes.
just keeping an eye on chat here.
I see one about certainly the characteristics of the former permanent pool are now drastically changed. That is one tricky part with some of our data because we don't have necessarily a pre for in that impoundment area. We have more of a post removal look at it. So we can kind of talk about more how it's looking now in comparison to the other sites versus necessarily having a exact way to compare it to what it was as the pool. But the idea, yes, I mean that slide showing even just looking at the amount of water that's in there. See if it's actually close enough for me to go back to it. Yeah, the amount of water that was in there versus now is not in there. It's definitely a drastic change. But hopefully for the better.
Beth, did you have a comment, question?
Yeah, I would just add that there's not a great way to compare, for example, macroinvertebrates in an impounded waterway to a free flowing. The methods are just too different. So, that's the reason there's no direct comparison for macros or, other of the environmental habitat evaluation. The two things are just so different that you can't really go back and forth from one to another. I mean, you can't, there was 3 or 4 feet of sediment in some places, quite a bit more. You couldn't really put a logger to measure something kind of deep down into that sediment and then really consider it a comparable to go ahead then and put the logger into a gravel bottom stream and, expect the method to be comparable.
That's a great point. Thank you, Beth.
Okay, I saw a question from Caitlin. Is there wildlife avian monitoring occurring in the adjacent restored riparian habitat?
I am not sure. I do know we do some sampling of the trees that are planted for us in terms of survivability. And when we go out and look at the trees, we do take into account what wildlife may have been there. So we look for signs of browsing and things like that. But they're not, it is more geared towards the trees and in terms of their survivability, but we do try to take note of some of that and including as well. We've seen some use of some of the trees for like little birds' nests and things, but I don't know if there's any like structured study going on in that habitat.
Great, thanks. And I see just a comment from Debbie. The DEP is working on a
Yes.
database for community water monitoring partners to store their continuous data. So as Chloe mentioned, we have some data in the eco sheds, and hopefully it sounds like one day we'll have more of that information publicly
That would be
available and
wonderful.
accessible. Let's see. Speaking of sediment, are there considerations to restoring historic adjoining wetlands that may have been present prior to, oops, sorry, I got another comment and it moved. Prior to dam construction, is there concern for eventual incised stream channel as the creek refines a historic bed? So, and I don't know, Beth, if you're still on or want to talk a little bit about the sediment management.
I, I can say that part of the design process and the engineering studies, during that phase, we will look for the historic bed, right? The bathymetry will attempt to kind of go to refusal there. So we'll start to see where's the gravel, or if it's a bedrock stream, where's the bedrock. So in general, a project team will have a good idea of what the elevation of the original bed is. And we expect to get down close to that bed by project's end, but it is often a few years before you reach that bed. But that is known. So in other words, you wouldn't consider a project complete if you were, a foot and a half above the historic bed. So we do expect some meandering, as any river would, over the first few years and after any major storms. But it's kind of not a blind process. We have some ideas from our engineers as we go into the process.
Thanks, Beth. I see a hand up from Foster. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess this actually might be a question for Beth again because it's about impounded sediment. I was curious what the percent of impounded sediment versus mobile sediment that you guys found in the initial estimation of what your mobile sediment might have been, because thinking about how much scour, it sounds like you had a lot more scour downstream than you did aggradation of sediment. And when you guys were figuring out figuring out the process for notching and the down draw of the dam. It looks like it might be a low head dam, but I'm not sure. That was another question of mine. Um, did you find that maybe that the amount that you notched led to a larger amount of water, less sediment to be able to get in, but that also ended up being more sediment that wasn't mobile and stayed behind where the impounded area used to be?
Yeah, so again, and I'm gonna let, if someone from Princeton Hydro, I didn't see if Jeff was on. But so again, as a result of those engineering studies, including bathymetry, you'll have a good idea of how much sediment is in behind a dam. And then look a little bit closer at the physical characteristics of that. Is it fine? Is it clay? Is it gravel? Is it so using that and the width and depth of the expected channel, you'll get an idea of how much of that is going to move through and how much will remain on site, and of what remains on site, how much of that is going to become stream bank, right? And that'll let you know whether or not you need to excavate any, or if you're, in the case of the Columbia Dam, the Delaware River was right there. So while we did not want to let, I believe, the approximate amount of sediment passed on that site was roughly 70,000 cubic yards over a few years. And it is metered by that notching, and gradually widening and lowering the dam. So the dam removal took place over a full year there. I'm trying to think, it may have even been a little bit longer until the entire dam was taken down to the elevation of the stream bed. So I don't know if I fully answered your question. Yes, they know before they go in how much sediment we expect to pass, and that leads to the strategy of how exactly it passes. And a major consideration here was we had a big river to release into. So you basically want to say, you know, what's the turbidity like in a bad storm, you know, like in a typical, you know, 50-year storm or something, 20-year storm. You want to make sure you're not doing more than that, right? You know what the river can handle, and you're trying to not dose it out more than that. A contrary example is up at the Paulina removal. We did actually excavate 8,000 cubic yards of sediment because, again, you know, what is below that? Not only 10 miles of the Paulins Kill, but 10 kind of flat miles, right? So we wouldn't want an excessive amount of sediment to be delivered to a flat downstream area. So again, the math is done. What do we expect to move? What does this typically move during, you know, during a storm, over a season? And then take that into consideration when deciding what goes off site, and deciding again the speed of the actual moving from a notch to moving to complete removal, which again on the Paulina removal began in November of 23, and the complete removal was done by the end of September of 24. I see.
Thank you.
And Xanthea, is that how you pronounce your name? I apologize if not. Go ahead.
Yeah. I work with the Forest Service and am hoping to do a project similar to this in a few dams in South Carolina. So I was just wondering, when thinking about planning future projects, was there any data that you wish you would have collected, or anything you wish that you would have did differently?
I'll go ahead and just say that one of the biggest things with a project of this size, we really wanted to make sure that we were collecting everything that we cared about and everything that would actually show something that related to the project's success. And so Chloe's presentation today was just a small snapshot of some of the information that was collected. And so we knew up front that we had to work with a lot of different stakeholders and monitoring partners to collect different pieces of information. So I think for now, I do think we have a wealth of information that not just the Nature Conservancy has, but we're also, a lot that we didn't talk about today is the biological components. And so we have conducted, working in partnership with others, the fish data collection. I know Academy of Natural Sciences, I think Dave was on the call. They were working on American eel surveys. We did contract out some freshwater mussel work. So I guess a piece of advice would be to make sure you have all the things that you do care about, but recognizing that your one organization may not be the one that's going to collect everything. I think, and maybe Chloe would answer differently, but I think for us, we feel we have a lot of information.
I agree.
But I think that's also very important, because at the beginning we were collecting so much information that you have to make sure you're going to use everything. And so you don't want to really waste time or resources collecting information that you wouldn't use. So I hope that answers your question. I don't know, Chloe, if you had anything else to add.
I think that kind of would fall along the same lines as my answer. And you kind of touched on making sure that the data, one, you want to make sure you have enough data, but you want to make sure that it's actually something you'll use, because otherwise you sit and you try to think, oh, I did all this work. How can I actually tie this in? Because that's definitely, if you have too much, it gets harder sometimes to write the story.
Sorry, Chloe.
Oh, you're fine.
I would also recommend on njdams.org, which is where the webinar will be saved from today. We also have a monitoring drop-down menu and kind of a how-to, and we have a lot of different references and resource guides on how to collect scientific data for your project, the different types of and methods that you can use to collect information, the different things you may want to look at. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to take a look around njdams.org for more information. I think I see one more question in the chat. I think Beth answered the Paulina activity start and end date, but we did started collecting data in 2015 for the Paulina Dam removal project as well, and we're still continuing to collect that information. And
I'll say, I
then,
mentioned that I've seen a little bit of turbidity stuff, but I haven't dug too much into some of the Paulina stuff because it is so fresh. There's a lot left to do there to compare. That's why I kind of mentioned it as like a left things to do is to compare kind of that Paulina activity to maybe some of the stuff we're seeing in Columbia, or even we have other sites between Paulina and Columbia as well. So it's something that I don't yet have an answer for, but I'm going to make sure I look for it and see if it is there or not.
Yeah, I just was clarifying. I was asking if you saw any of those effects from your Paulina removal influencing your measurements down at Columbia Dam, and how you might account for that, or how you might how you might account for that, or if if you saw you mentioned the turbidity, so did you see could the increased sediment that you saw at maybe some of your sites, could that have been from Paulina or some activity upstream?
It is technically possible. I would say it's something I need to look more into. Particularly, I think a lot of it depends on as well mobility in the streams, because I mentioned a little bit about the turbidity, but I want to look more into it because we also haven't had that much rain this year. So it could just be that they seem to be overlapping in time, but it's not necessarily actually the Paulina stuff. So I don't necessarily quite have an answer for that yet. But I would say the biggest thing that we can do for kind of identifying, I'm not sure if there is an exact way to say this sediment is from Paulina, this is from Columbia, unless it's because the timelines should be distinct enough that we can kind of separate it, but there's a little bit of that overlap. So it's more, I think, of I don't want to say speculation, but an educated speculation in terms of what we can actually see. I don't know if Beth or Michelle, you have any more on that.
I would just say, I mean, Chloe said this, the weather this year has not, we might see next year the sediment from
Yeah.
Paulina that we might have seen this year. We had any precipitation, it can be teased out likely to some extent, but I don't know if we'll ever be able to, fully tease out. If we had 20 years of pre-data, we could see what we should have expected, but I think we're gonna just have to make an educated guess, like Chloe said.
okay, folks, so it is a little after 2. I think we have 1 or 2 more questions in the chat. Happy to stay on to continue to answer questions, but did want to just let folks know, no worries if you have to jump off. Okay, so after Paulina is the intention to remove the rest of the dams that are along the Paulins Kill. I would just say that TNC has been leading a couple removals, particularly 4 dam removals that we've just completed. There was a privately owned dam above the Paulina, and that was all the work that we were set to do. The only other dam that is really a barrier on the main stem Paulins Kill is the Paulins Kill Lake Dam, and that nobody has any intentions of removing that. It is a prominent lake community. So did you look at or notice any change to the macroinvertebrate community structure, any change in presence or absence of certain functional feeding guilds?
I have not looked at it directly because we do send out our macroinvertebrates and essentially get back an index, and that's what I've looked at so far. So I don't know quite yet, but it is something that I would like to look at and see a little bit more kind of how that breaks up. But it should be factored, this idea of the index should take into account some of these presence or absences, particularly if they're really important guilds in the area. It should impact that index if all of a sudden one of them is not there or there's a ton of them in an area. That idea of both abundance and type should help with that.
And I think I see one last question in the chat. How are you managing all the data generated by the project and specific tools / approaches you can recommend?
So most of the data that we are managing, we do kind of our QA/QC flagging of maybe stuff that shouldn't be included in analyses in Excel, but that does require kind of going through everything. So we do have kind of an Excel sheet set up to ping flags back at us if, say, you have this massive jump between a 15-minute, 15-minute apart data points, it'll flag, and then I can mark whether or not I think that that should be included. But then the rest of the analyses and things are handled in R, particularly since this is such a large data set. I really can't imagine trying to do it in another method. I think that that's kind of the way you have to approach it. And I will also say, as I'm digging through some of it, what I've done in the past working with large data sets and what I'm kind of doing with this one is I visualize everything together and then very much break it into 1 or 2 sites and see kind of what's going on with that and play with it. And that's how you kind of can see some of the trends, because looking at it all together, even looking at the 9 years of data together, is overwhelming sometimes. So I know that's not super specific, but I hope that's a little bit helpful. I'm happy to talk more about it as well, if you'd like.
Great. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, and I don't see any other hands up. So if there are no other questions, I will just take a moment to thank Chloe so much for pulling together a great presentation. And I would encourage you to continue to reach out with any questions and keep an eye out for the next information session. I don't believe we have any more scheduled for this year. I believe we will have about maybe 4 or 6 coming up for next year. So do keep an eye out. And this presentation was recorded, and you can find that on the YouTube channel and/or njdams.org. With that, thank you all for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.